Welcome back. Lesson 2, what is trauma?
When I first started to learn about trauma, it wasn't very clear to me. We didn't talk about trauma, we talked about sin. We certainly believed that there were things in life that were traumatic. Still, we ignored all the symptoms that are now becoming apparent because we assume that we just needed to pray more, read the Bible, and dedicate ourselves to the Christian narrative.
First, we assumed the root problem was that we were all sinners. When we committed ourselves to Christ, we thought that God fixed everything. After all, Scripture told us we were new creations when we submitted to the right belief system. When we saw evidence contradicting that assumption, we employed the age-old strategy of spiritual bypassing.
According to Robert Augustus Masters, spiritual bypassing is the use of spiritual practices and beliefs to avoid dealing with our painful feelings, unresolved wounds, and developmental needs. It is much more common than we might think, and in fact, it is so pervasive as to go largely unnoticed except in more obvious extremes. As religious institutions, we certainly experienced those that were victims of traumatic events, including all kinds of abuse, rape, neglect, and all forms of mistreatment. But we didn't understand how these people's experiences had left them with permanent damage that needed attention, and we certainly didn't know how to help them.
When we love bombed them on the way in the door, it helped them to regulate, even though we didn't know what that word meant. When we told them we had hope for them and that God had a purpose for them, it made it easy for them to believe in our doctrine that promised to recreate them. We hugged and prayed with them, but unfortunately, that didn't strike at the root of their issues.
We occasionally considered therapy by a licensed counselor. Still, usually that got pushed aside because all of our effort and a lot of our money was invested in the other solution. As a pastor, I struggled with who I could tell and what people would think of me if I needed counseling. What do you do when your solutions are not helping? What do you do when you realize that all the solutions you thought were from God are not having the impact you hoped they would? We have a habit of attributing all good things to God, and when things don't go the way we think they should, we blame it on ourselves and try to ignore the obvious. Laura and I have realized that part of the blame lies squarely on our shoulders as clergy. We sold a belief system that didn't even understand trauma, yet proclaimed that it was complete and perfect. Considering this, I realized that I was responsible, and along with healing myself, I propose to help others as well. We can't push down, minimize, and hope it will magically improve. When I went through my dark night of the soul, I realized trauma didn't go away just because I denied it was there. It demanded to be acknowledged. This weekend, which I described in my book, Being, changed my life.
So, as we go into the discussion of this part, I want to know from you, why is it important that we address trauma?
Yeah, I think one of the main reasons is because we've kind of been really ignorant about it for a long time. I mean, Carl Jung and some of these guys started unraveling this stuff 100 years ago, but that's not that long ago. Our Christian doctrines go back thousands of years, and those Christian doctrines made very little consideration of trauma because they didn't understand it. Surely it's something magical that's got to happen because this problem we can't seem to solve, right? People come into our churches with trauma. Sometimes we make that worse, but we really don't have a good solution. And that's how we felt, I think, as a couple doing ministry, is people would come to us with trauma, and issues and all those things, and we really weren't equipped to help them.
For sure.
If we'd have been a licensed therapist, that would have helped.
Well, a trauma-informed therapist, even better.
And now, now that we know trauma-informed, therapist would, like you said, would be better. But just understanding that person's not sinful,
Mm.
it's not that they, doing witchcraft or something on the side that makes them act
Mhm.
this way.
Mhm.
It's the stuff they've been through, and it's
Right.
unraveling that. So,
Yeah, and I think we have to understand that, based on the book, the body keeps a score. That is in fact true, that your body holds on, your nervous system holds on to that trauma. And by pressing it down, bypassing it, not dealing with it, we aren't doing ourselves any favors. It still remains in our body.
mhm,
And so, you can bypass it, you can press it down, you can deny it all you want, but your nervous system, your body remembers that trauma, and it's not going to let you just bypass it forever. There will come a time when you have to deal with that
yeah,
trauma.
and whether we admit it or not, or whether people out there want to admit it or not, religion definitely bypasses
Mm.
things. That's part of the deal.
Mhm.
We kind of pray together, we get together and regulate ourselves, which is
Mhm.
good,
Mhm.
but then we don't solve the ultimate problem. And so it'll all be better by and by, or we'll understand it better by and by,
Mhm.
and all those songs and the things we say
Mhm.
just bypass us, to where we're not healing what's giving us we're not getting to the root of the problem.
Well, and it can also um, heap on more trauma if you
Hmm.
think about it, because as we're praying or as we're singing, it's, oh, what a wretch am I? What a terrible sinner I am.
Hmm.
And, we've been through this traumatic event or traumatic years of growing up or traumatic marriage or abuse situation or whatever. And we're basically taking on the responsibility of that, which just adds to our trauma. It must be my fault. I'm a wretched sinner. I'm no good. And, that, I mean, just even thinking about that brings me anxiety. Like I can feel that in my own body right now, because we are not helping someone heal when we do those things from their trauma. We are
Hmm.
actually re-traumatizing and adding more trauma to the
Hmm.
situation. So why do you think churches and other religious groups are afraid, and I'll put that in air quotes, are afraid to deal with trauma?
Yeah.
Or are they? Maybe it's something else.
I think one of the reasons is they don't understand,
Yeah.
and they don't. But the other thing is, a lot of we know from being in a church for 20 years and running the show and
Hmm.
seeing how the sausage is made. Most of the time is dedicated to keeping the show running, to keeping the Sunday morning
Hmm.
and the programs we have running, and paying the staff, keeping the building up, having a place for people to come into, and we're
Hmm.
focused on those people coming in,
Hmm.
and we got to keep them coming in because there's also people going out. And so most of our energy and effort was on that, especially in a smaller church. We had
Hmm.
to help clean the toilets, and things
Right.
like that. So there's a lot of work to be done. There's very little time for that work.
Hmm.
We're not willing to shut down the Sunday morning service to just be with each other
Right.
and maybe have some counseling.
Hmm.
It's the show must go on. We got to
Hmm.
get our adrenaline rush and things like that.
Hmm.
So I've said this a lot of times. I don't think pastors are evil, and I don't think they have evil
Hmm.
intentions. They do tend to be narcissists, which is part of the problem. But for the most part, they want to help people. That's why they got into
Hmm.
ministry. But
Hmm.
the system just doesn't work
Hmm.
to help with that.
I think it's interesting because you used to always say in our churches that we pastored, keep the main thing the main thing.
Hmm.
And we always assumed that was Jesus, God, whatever.
Evangelism. Yeah.
Um, yeah, but even so, like the main thing to Christ was people.
Hmm.
And so, maybe we should shift our thinking and organize religion to what the main thing really is.
Hmm.
Jesus talked a lot about, helping your neighbor, helping the widow, helping the orphans. And how much of that do we really do?
Yeah.
And all those
It's
things
less
can
than
be very,
10%. I mean,
yeah,
by
and all those things
money.
can be very traumatizing.
Yeah. So let's see if we can clearly define what is trauma. This is number one. What is trauma?
Number one, what is trauma? According to the American Psychological Association, trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, rape, or natural disaster. Immediately after the event, shock and denial are typical. Longer term reactions include unpredictable emotions, flashbacks, strained relationships, and even physical symptoms like headaches and nausea. In his book, Waking the Tiger, Dr. Peter Levine says a traumatic event is defined as an event that causes a long term dysregulation in the autonomic and core nervous system.
Every day we are defining and clarifying these definitions of trauma and how it affects us. But please notice how they use these two words, event and response. Trauma is not just something that happened to us, but it is how we responded to it or how we were not able to respond to it that causes trauma to persist. Trauma events are also not just sexual events. Sexual abuse is a big problem in the church, but it's not our only problem. Many times, trauma comes from a caregiver who wasn't able to respond in a way that would have regulated us and avoided the wound becoming stuck.
Beliefs like eternal conscious torment, hell, often cause the issue. Our wrestling with terrifying beliefs causes a response that wounds us. This is also not our fault, but we should address it.
So, can you speak to the idea that all trauma is relevant?
Yeah, I really like what we were just talking about because we have to remember that one person's traumatic event um, is not the same as another person. So, what one person might determine as a terrible experience, what you might think of it was a terrible experience in your childhood, may not have been something either I experienced or if I did experience it, maybe it didn't have the same effect on me as far as trauma goes. Um, I think that trauma, in my opinion, is very subjective because it really depends on how the person's nervous system kind of attaches to that trauma. But irregardless, it's all valid, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you feel that event in your life was traumatic and the same event in my life was not, it is still, your trauma is still valid,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think we just have to be really careful because when we start saying, oh, well, you had it worse than I did, or,
Mm-hmm.
I hear that a lot from people bypassing, but once we do that, then we're actually bypassing our own trauma. We are
Mm-hmm.
not taking care of our nervous system.
Right.
And if we're feeling those flashbacks and those physical symptoms that you talked about, then that's our body's way of telling us that we've got to deal with this, that was a traumatic event, irregardless of whether anybody else thinks it was traumatic. For our body, that was traumatic, and we need to deal with it.
Yeah. Some of the definitions, like in this definition that we quoted, they'll say terrible
Mm-hmm.
or hurricanes and
Mm-hmm.
natural disasters and things like that. Those things are definitely traumatizing.
Mm-hmm.
But just as much for some people, like me, would be was my mother, not there at a time when I needed her to be
Mm-hmm.
there. And
Mm-hmm.
that's just an example. But a lot of the things I uncovered in my spiritual journey, my recovery, has been that it was kind of it was those little things
Mm-hmm.
that somehow stuck and didn't get resolved, and so
Mm-hmm.
they got stuck. And then when we finally dug down, then those things come up, or they're if we don't deal with them, they'll come out sideways and they'll express their self in weird ways.
Mm-hmm.
So
As a teacher, we consider COVID to be a collective trauma. Now, you may talk to some people and they either thought COVID was a hoax or not that big of a deal. But for others, and including our children, it was a collective trauma that is still having lasting effects even today. I can speak to
Hmm.
that about in our classrooms today.
Yeah, indeed. So let's move on to number two.
Number two, it's in the body.
In the past, I got mad at myself for not understanding this sooner, but then I realized that it wasn't that long ago that Carl Jung helped us begin to understand things like shadow and inner child and archetypes. We can now scan the body and the brain so we know much more about what makes us tick.
Another very recent understanding is the work of Bessel A. van der Kolk concerning where our trauma is stored. In his book, The Body Keeps a Score, he states traumatized people chronically feel unsafe inside their bodies. The past is alive in the form of gnawing interior discomfort. Their bodies are consistently bombarded by visceral warning signs, and in an attempt to control these processes, they often become experts at ignoring their gut feelings and in numbing awareness of what is playing out inside. They learn to hide themselves. He continues, the mind needs to be re educated to feel physical sensations, and the body needs to be helped to tolerate and enjoy the comforts of touch. Individuals who lack emotional awareness can connect their physical sensations to psychological events. Then they can slowly reconnect with themselves.
As we discuss later in this book, Eugene Genlin, who discovered focusing, explains why this matters that trauma is stored in our bodies and we must make a mind body connection. He states, what is split off, not felt, remains the same. But when it is felt, it changes. Most people don't know this. They think that by not permitting the feelings of their negative ways, they make themselves good. But on the contrary, that keeps these negatives static, the same from year to year. A few moments of feeling it in your body allows it to change. And if there is something in you that is bad or sick or unsound, let it inwardly be and breathe. That's the only way it can evolve and change into the form it needs. Along with some of my good friends, I've discovered the usefulness of these understandings. When I could be with that part of my body that was trying to help me, my life changed for the better. And we will discuss that a little later in the book.
So, what does it mean that trauma causes us to feel chronically unsafe in our bodies?
Yeah, I think when there's shadow there, when there's things that need to be addressed, we say sometimes they come out sideways,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so if I say, well, I need to go inside, I need to get in touch with my body, and a lot of times when I do that, I feel that
Mm-hmm.
I feel uncomfortable because there's something there that's not good or normal, or ultimately it's going to be good that I address it,
Mm-hmm.
but it feels painful. It's kind of like when we're having conversations with other people and they bring up something traumatic.
Mm.
It makes us all uncomfortable,
Yeah.
and I think that's where some of us live. Was just we know there's something there that needs to be addressed, but then we go inside and it feels weird, it feels hard, it feels
Mm-hmm.
uncomfortable, and all those. So we avoid things like
Yeah.
that. We avoid pain and seek
Mm-hmm.
pleasure and all that stuff, but uh, we're just chronically there and we don't trust ourselves.
Right. And I think that's a message of religion, partially,
Mm-hmm.
is to not trust yourself. And I think a lot of the reason, like for so long, that I pushed a lot of my trauma down was just because if I admit to it, then I'm admitting that I'm a terrible person, that I'm a sinner. So
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of like all those
Yeah, it's
messages.
falsely connected with
Hmm.
sin,
Right.
and you're something's wrong inside
Hmm.
because you're sinful,
Hmm.
and you need to confess that sin. And then,
Hmm.
but then we confess that sin. We say we're sorry for whatever it was. I can't even really
Hmm.
address. but it still doesn't go away.
Right. It may feel better in the moment,
Hmm.
right? You might feel better for a day, a week, maybe even a month or two, but I promise you it's going to resurface.
Hmm.
Like until I specifically dealt with my trauma, it kept coming back. And then I would then that would cause me to even feel worse about myself because it's like you go, why can't I get over this? Why am I still dealing with this?
Hmm.
So it's such a vicious cycle. So I think we talked a little bit about this, but why do we avoid that connection with the body? Do you think part of it is we're taught in religion not to do that?
Hmm. Yeah, I remember those messages very clearly. Don't trust yourself.
Mhm.
You're completely wicked. Your inner self is bad.
Mhm.
Your core self is bad. And don't go there.
Mhm.
Don't, just pray the blood over it or whatever religious sounding things you want to put on it. But then we notice 20 years later that we've been stuffing things down for 20 years and
Mhm.
then it all comes out at once or comes out sideways. So
Mhm.
we need to learn to trust ourselves and our intuition, like we talked about not
Right.
too long ago.
Right.
Let's go on to number three.
Okay. Number three, what about religious trauma? Therapist.com says religious trauma occurs when a person's religious experience is stressful, degrading, dangerous, abusive, or damaging. Traumatic religious experiences may harm or threaten to harm someone's physical, emotional, mental, sexual, or spiritual health and safety. Just like the standard definition, it is not just the event, but how the organization and the survivor respond.
It may be that a religious leader perpetrated the trauma, such as sexual assault or direct attacks by those in power. The event may have religious implications, such as being deemed that the person's spiritual life is threatened. To make matters worse, the spiritual community's response might worsen if there's an overemphasis on shaming ideas about what God thinks or did, or a minimizing of the event's impact.
Survivors may withdraw from sharing to avoid shaming, shunning, or separation from the group.
As I mentioned earlier, sometimes the catalyst is a belief that may or may not be attached to an event. Beliefs about hell and human depravity can set the table for further trauma. Because religion is also an organization, the needs of the individual can easily be overlooked. The website lists 10 symptoms of spiritual abuse.
Number one, self hatred. Number two, shame. Number three, perfectionism. Number four, hypervigilance. Number five, difficulty making decisions. Number six, loss of community. Number seven, lack of boundaries. Number eight, delayed social milestones. Number nine, sexual dysfunction. Number 10, mental health disorders.
The Global Center for Religious Research, GCRR, gives us another definition of religious trauma. Religious trauma results from an event, a series of events, relationships, or circumstances within or connected to religious beliefs, practices, or structures that is experienced by an individual as overwhelming or disruptive and has lasting adverse effects on a person's physical, mental, social, emotional, or spiritual well being.
They also report some alarming news in their study titled Percentage of U.S. Adults Suffering from Religious Trauma, a Sociological Study. This sociological study aimed to ascertain the percentage of adults living in the United States who have experienced religious trauma, also known as RT, and what percentage presently suffers from RT symptoms. After compiling data from 1,581 adults living in the United States, this study concludes it is likely that around one third, 27 to 33% of US adults conservatively have experienced religious trauma at some point in their lives. That number increases to 37% if those suffering from any three of the six major RT symptoms are included. It is also likely that around 10 to 15% of US adults currently suffer from religious trauma if only the most conservative numbers are highlighted. Nonetheless, since 37% of the respondents personally know people who potentially suffer from RT, and 90% of those respondents know between 1 and 10 people who likely suffer from RT, then it could be argued that as many as 1 in 5 or 20% of US adults presently suffer from significant religious trauma symptoms.
In most definitions of trauma, religious and otherwise, we usually see that there is an event. As we mentioned before, there is an event and an experience of that event. Please resist the religious urge to point fingers at the survivors, telling them, see, it's all how you took it. Because we tend to blame the victim, better named survivor, we should probably talk about these events. Sometimes they are called adverse religious experiences, or AREs. According to GCRR, AREs are an experience of religious belief, practice, or structure that undermines an individual's sense of safety or autonomy and or negatively impacts their physical, social, emotional, relational, sexual, or psychological well-being. These experiences have the potential of resulting in religious trauma.
Interestingly, AREs are generally divided into abuse, neglect, and communal practices. The first two are obvious and can be subdivided into emotional, verbal, physical, and spiritual. So, an obvious ARE could be sexual abuse or sexual neglect, verbal abuse, verbal neglect, etc. But it surprised me to discover communal practices are an ARE and that many descriptions or variations exist to notice. GCRR lists the following as ARE examples in communal practices:
community violence, bullying, threats, intimidation, terrorism, public outing, stigmatizing, and branding, forced confessions, shunning and excommunication, brainwashing or forced indoctrination,
social, familial isolation, information privatization, scapegoating, othering, identify disruption, emotional manipulation, phobia induction, dress, behavioral control, segregation,
love bombing and trauma bonding, stalking or harassment, forced conversion, conversion therapy, forced ritual performance, substance abuse, financial fraud, financial, sexual, or other exploitation. I believe it helps to know that these AREs don't always cause experiences of religious trauma like anxiety, depression, nightmares, self-harm, etc. Still, many people will experience religious trauma responses.
So that's a big list of communal practices that we mentioned in that last section. But that seems to be the underlying message, is that we need community. I mean, we heard that when we were contemplating leaving organized religion. Well, what will you do about community?
Mhm.
So can you speak to that?
Yeah, so the three categories are abuse, neglect, and communal practices. So it surprised me that whole list we just read was from communal practices.
Right.
There is abuse. There's direct abuse.
Mhm.
There's neglect.
Mhm.
There's all of those obvious things. And in the
Mhm.
church, it seems like only sexual misconduct will even get your hand slapped, especially if you're a pastor.
Right.
But a lot of that, we say, well, we need community because we need connection.
Mhm.
And we say, well, then we need community. But community, a lot of times, is what is driving the events, those experiences, those
Mm-hmm.
events that later cause trauma
Mm-hmm.
or lend to our trauma. So I think it's important to realize that and to take a hard look at our religion and say, what are those experiences inside religion that are just, they're not helping? And they may be traumatizing
Mm-hmm.
to me. They may be driving people into a shell, and things like that. And then there's just so many ways that turns into abuse and neglect, and it all kind of runs
It
together
does,
after a
yeah.
while. But be careful when we say, well, we got to go to church because we need community,
Mm-hmm.
where, you can get community anywhere,
Right.
really. But it's that faux community that they want us to fall into because then that lines up with their beliefs and adds to their numbers and so on. And no, everybody says we're generalizing when we say things like that. But look how many things, and you read the book, you can look at the chapter and look at those things. Look how many things come from the communal practices,
Mm-hmm.
not abuse, not someone's getting raped or
Mm-hmm.
someone's, just supremely neglected. It's those same communal practices that we think are doing good,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes are doing the opposite.
Yep, exactly.
So let's move on to number 4.
Number 4, how religion becomes traumatic.
As we listen to people's stories in the desert, we notice the commonality of most of them discussing a common diagnosis of PTSD from their religious trauma and what they experienced trying to address it. If you want to learn more about this, see the work of Dr. Marlene Winnow, Religious Trauma Syndrome, or Judith Herman, Complex PTSD. The CPTSD Foundation describes how religion becomes traumatic by referencing Herman's prism of captivity, dominion, and personality erosion. The author believes these concepts clearly illustrate that there is a clear connection between the symptoms of religious trauma and complex PTSD. For me, it didn't take imagination at all to see captivity, domination, and personality erosion in most, if not all, of the stories of religious trauma survivors we talked to.
But just understanding the problem doesn't get us to healing. The criticism we hear about talk therapy is that it typically only engages the mind. What we need is something that familiarizes us with our bodies so that instead of only understanding and regulating our trauma, we can engage with the body and integrate those wounded parts of us. May I introduce you to somatic therapies? These experiences explore how the body expresses deeply painful experiences, applying mind body healing to aid in trauma recovery. For us, our primary healing process was called focusing, developed in the 1970s, but you will find what is best for you. More information follows in the chapters ahead.
I hope this gives you some introductory information, and I wish you all well as you dive deeper. These definitions that we've given you will get you started, but it'll be when you do your own research, when you do your own healing, that you begin to uncover them, and we'll give more details later in the book.
So, lesson 2 action steps. Number 1, write down a working definition of trauma.
Number 2, how is trauma stored in the body, and why does that matter?
Number 3, what are some examples of religious trauma that you have seen or experienced?
What are AREs? Which ones have you seen or experienced?
Read the article on the CPTSD Foundation website titled How Religion Becomes Traumatic.
It may help to list some regulating things religion provided, followed by the toxic parts or the way it failed to address the trauma you brought to the table.
And we'll see you in lesson 3.